Alright, so this will be the first video for this channel I've recorded. I wanted to discuss on this channel some of my philosophical ideas, some of my ideas about a variety of topics really, about what's traditionally considered philosophy, but as well as ideas that are in the political and the theological realms as well, but kind of a philosophical take on them, not so much a, hopefully, an ideological or, factional approach, but more of a philosophical approach to various topics. Because I have ideas all the time and they're always going around in my head, but you can only keep things in your head for so long before you start to forget them. It's one of the limits of memory, and like Nietzsche says, somewhere, I can't remember where, but he says that it is not a flaw, but a feature, basically, of human memory that we forget, and not just details or trivia, or the fact that some things necessarily become trivia, but we have to forget some things for new information to come in properly, but we also have to forget things for our ideas to be able to take their proper order and shape. In fact, it would be complete madness to have a equal ability to remember every single thing that you ever were conscious of thinking. So, that being said, I want to get some of my ideas written down on paper, or, if you like, recorded on video and put on my YouTube channel that I'm starting. So in this video, I want to discuss the principles of conservatism, conservatism, and progressivism, but not in terms of what their goals are, if you like not like what are the progressives trying to achieve, what are the conservatives trying to achieve, not that sort of idea, but more in line with what their formal principles are, or what their formal principles might be, or what their method is. So what is like methodological conservatism and methodological progressivism. And I want to make a distinction between these two types of ways of looking at progressivism and conservatism. On the one hand, the methodological, and on the other, the sort of the material, or perhaps the teleological, if you like, perhaps. Maybe the teleological is the best idea for that. So, because when we think of progressives and conservatives, we often think of what their goals are, what they're trying to achieve, But on the other hand, I think it's important to consider the methods by which they achieve their goals, or if you like, their relationship to, or their understanding of, change as far as it relates to human nature and society. So from a methodological conservatism, I would say, is the belief that change is disruptive, that change, even the best changes, are shocking to the body, politics, to society, to the individuals, that they're like anywhere from getting into cold water to clean yourself off, or hot water to treat you have an infected finger and you're soaking it in hot water. Anywhere from just that all the way to how surgery is a shock to the body, but can be necessary. And so, from methodologically, from the conservative point of view, change is jarring and shocking and disruptive, and thus must be approached cautiously and perhaps avoided when possible. Now one can say that change is inevitable, the world's always changing, things are always in a state of flux, and that might be true. But there can be periods in which change is accelerated and when change is slower. On the other hand, methodologically, progressivism is the belief, I'm saying, that change is natural to humanity, to human society, to individuals. As we said, things are always changing, and this is meat and right, if you like. It is simply the way of things, and change is happening anyways, and so therefore changes might as well be made for the better. Since everything's changing all the time, we may as well sort of direct those changes towards good ends. And therefore, change towards a good goal is the best of all possible worlds, if you like. Maybe not quite best of all possible worlds, but it is the best you can hope for, or in fact, it's great. And in this case, from their point of view, slowness of change, hampering, impeding change, and even perhaps preserving a status quo, is not only perhaps counterproductive and perhaps even malicious, but it's just simply unnatural, and it's a fiction. And what you're doing is violence to the system, violence to reality, and violence to the people who live in reality. And so, from a methodologically progressive point of view, change is good, and it's healthy and invigorating. And change towards a good goal, so combining methodological progressivism with teleological progressivism, you have the ideal of progressivism. Whereas, methodological conservatism, if it's coupled with teleological conservatism, would be we need to resist the urge to change things quickly, at least. Any changes that need to be done incrementally, piecemeal, and carefully. And of course, that would be going back towards, preserving. Let's say we're going to be changing things so that, we're in a time of rapid change towards, some indeterminate future, and we're like, whoa, let's slow this down. In fact, we're not going to make it stop all at once. What's the word they're using these days? We're going to off-ramp from the highway of change, the fast lane. We're first going to get into the slow lane, then we're going to get off onto the feeder, or the service, the frontage road, and slow down, and then finally slow down, and finally go off onto one of the little side streets where we can go 25 miles an hour, a nice safe speed, and thus, able to change little bits here and there. And if we're trying to go back to some previous state that we think we should never have left, that's our teleological conservative goal, then we can start changing things back that way. But piecemeal, and ever just incrementally. But of course, so that is methodological conservatism coupled with teleological conservatism. However, I don't see why there's any reason why the methodology has to be coupled up with its methodological conservatism has to be coupled with teleological conservatism, and why methodological progressivism has to be coupled with teleological progressivism. In fact, I first had these thoughts. Basically, I think you could be someone who, in your goals, you're a conservative, or even a reactionary, if you want to use that word. You could be a conservative in goals, but a progressive in your relationship to change. So you could say, well, we want to go back, or we either want to preserve things as they are, and it's racing away from things, or we want to go back, let's say we want to go back to how it was at some point in time that we see as being better. And so, or, either one. Either we want to preserve it as it is, or we want to go back. But I don't see why you couldn't say, okay, and to achieve this, we're going to drastically change all the things. Maybe all the institutions have been set up such into a very towards progressive goals. Or maybe we've already moved largely towards progressive goals. And these conservatives, these teleological conservatives, are like, no. And we need to stop this immediately, so no off-ramping. Instead, we're just going to hit the brakes right in the fast lane. And if that causes a pile up behind us, well, you know what? Such is life. We got to stop this immediately. Or maybe we're going to say, maybe everyone will just put up a stop now and hope that everyone doesn't crash. Or maybe we'll jump off the freeway and hope we land on our tires. But, either way, we're going to stop. We're going to change drastically and immediately. And in fact, we may even see the shocking nature of changes as healthy and medicinal and invigorating. But anyways, we'd be going towards a conservative goals. Maybe we want to go back to a previous state in time, if you like, how things used to be. But we're not worried about getting there gradually. We're like, no, right away. In fact, the sooner the better. Drastic surgery is needed immediately. On the other hand, I don't see why someone who is a teleological progressive could not be, in methodology, rather conservative. In fact, be very conservative. Meaning, yes, they want these sort of goals for the future. They want society to change to become some way, shape, or form, better. And it's not how it is now, but we can get there. But they want to get there in a careful, sort of incremental way. That just because that progress needs to be careful and methodical, not slow, but maybe slow, but not all at once, and not to shock the system. That shocking the system, too much change too quickly, is going to damage the organism of society, or the people in society, and you're just going to cause chaos as likely as not, and then make the project collapse. And so I think you could be a methodological conservative while being a teleological progressive, just as I think you could be a conservative in your goals, your teleology, but be a progressive in your methods and your approach to change. Of course, many progressives are also progressives in teleology are also progressive in their methodology, and same with conservatives, conservative. So there seems to be these four different possibilities. I first got this, my first inklings of this idea, I suppose, came to me a long time ago. I was reading probably about 12 years ago? Probably about 12, 13 years ago. I was reading, maybe a little bit, no, probably about 14 years ago. I was reading Karl Popper. I had picked up these books, The Open Society and Its Enemies. They used to be always at Barnes and Noble. I always saw them, and I was like, so finally I bought the first one on Plato. Now, some people don't think he does a very good job of his take on Plato is not the best, and maybe that's true. And the second one is on Hegel and Marx. But what struck me in them was not so much his take on any particular philosopher, but was his way of looking at what he called the way we should try to change society towards whatever goal we're looking to arrive at. And he said there was a lot of people who were all too eager to engage in what he called top-down, I think it was top-down social engineering, just from the top, all at once, just wham, and massive, and to his mind, shocking and very prone to making errors and damaging society. He, on the other hand, advocated what he called piecemeal social engineering. Now, of course, the term social engineering has a bad connotation, probably rightly so. But we can just take that and say attempting to change society, which conservatives and progressives all do. There's very few people who want to live in just let lie, just let things how they are. But even that is kind of probably a change, because right at any one point in time we usually aren't leaving things alone. We're doing things. So even the move towards just leaving them alone is, at least in its first steps, a change. So he talks about piecemeal social engineering as opposed to top-down or all at once or fell swoop social engineering. And I thought about that. That was interesting because, he struck me as someone who probably favored progressive goals. I could be wrong about this. It's been a long time. But he definitely seemed conservative or cautious in his methodology. Now, I can sort of attribute that to a couple things. One is he was not only he not only wrote in political philosophy, but he also wrote in philosophy of science, and so his sort of take on, how would I say, scientific method and methodology and all that stuff, I think probably influenced his take on social issues as well. And that, if I remember correctly, Popper favored a notion of what falsifiability, that falsification, like empirical method does not ever prove anything in a positive way, but rather it tries to disprove things. It can show that something is not the case, but it can't really determinately show something is the case. But it can show that something seems to be resistant to be to being proven false. But this is very much of that sort of piecemeal, careful lab, every step being careful, cautious. Change one variable, record that, see what happens. Change another variable, look at the results, record that. Every step is a careful step along the way. You don't want to just sort of, all right, we have all these laboratory conditions, and now let's just change it entirely different laboratory. Whoa. You need to, how are you going to see if the conditions are so different that there's no capacity for your experiment to be useful? You have to have everything, you want to narrow things down to such a point that you can make tiny incremental changes so you can test to see what happens. And I think that's what he wants for society too, is for social engineering, as he calls it, or social change or political change, societal change, to be done in such a way that we're changing things carefully and intentionally, piece by piece, and seeing what the result is, because we don't know, because he's a nominalist and an empiricist in many ways. And so he's very critical of sort of the historicists who think they can know the formal structure of the whole and then move on with this knowledge. He's like, no, really we don't. We really just know, we have an aggregate of knowledge that we can kind of like make generalizations from, but we really just know given our empirical investigations into the natural world and the realm of social realities as well. So we need to be very intentional and determinate how we tinker with things or alter things, because we don't know what the results are until we actually change it. And we won't know what the results were unless the changes we make are precise and limited enough in scope that we can have a good chance of being able to see what correlates with what. Well, I have A, B, C, and D here, and if I just move B a little bit, then I see what happens with the set. That one little, I don't want to change, A, B, A, C and see what happened. I mean, well, I don't know what. It could have been any number of things or combinations of things. So I think that's one reason why he's all for caution in societal change as well. And we also see kind of another influence on him, I think, in this, or maybe it's just goes without, well, that doesn't go without saying. In fact, it was interesting. He was very much an appreciator of Friedrich Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, which is interesting, and he actually caught some flack from some of his colleagues who were like, how can you read that dude's book and like it? Because a lot of people in American academia did not like Hayek's works because they're, it's like conservative, this and that and the other thing, blah, 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 blah. It's, free market, claptrap. And one guy talked to Popper and says, I read that you appreciated his work, even though you're not of the same persuasion as him. Why? I haven't read it myself because, I don't want to be sullied with it, and I've heard horrible things. But I think what it is that Popper is very much concerned with not crashing the system because you have grandiose goals and you want to arrive at them quickly, or you believe you have historical inevitability on your side and it doesn't matter what you do because it's destined to work out. His criticism of historicism, he was very much against both what he saw as the arch conservatism of Plato in the Republic, or at least as the Republic is laid out, trying to achieve a world of stasis on the one hand through drastic changes to society. Socrates is talking about how all the ways that you would have to change things to make this perfect society, the Callipolis, the beautiful or whatever city. And he sees this as just, he thinks it's terrible both in its goal, but also in its method. But he also thinks people like Hegel and Marx are wrong too, and that they have a more in the future sort of goal, and as a result of progress towards a future and advancing, not going back or halting. But Popper is critical of them as well. At first, he's kind of less critical of Marx because I think he kind of agrees with him in terms of teleology, but not in methodology. But later on, he comes to, he admits somewhere, I remember, that Marx is just as wrong as, he finds Marx to be as wrong as Hegel and Plato and all the others, that they're maybe both in goals and in method, but the errors in method alone are sufficient to discount Marxism for Popper. That methodological progressivism is dangerous or reckless. It is unscientific, and it is, based on very faulty principles that you can only, basically methodological progressivism thinks that, is postulated on the idea that change is good, and that the only thing better than some change is even more change, and the only thing better than even more change is even more change even faster and all at once. And he's like, this is the antithesis of a scientific approach to reality, both human and natural, and that if you want to destroy the society you're trying to improve, either by bringing it back to a more ideal state of prior affairs, which I don't think he was a believer in, but nonetheless, or moving it towards a future state of affairs that would be better, which I think he was a proponent of, then you need to do it in this more of what I'm calling a methodologically conservative way, that even if you're a progressive in goals, you need to go carefully, step by step, incrementally, testing out each of your ideas and each one of the initiatives, and make the initiatives not so much that they shock and damage society and turn people against your program, or just make society damaged generally, even if they don't turn against your program. And conversely, I would add that if you're a conservative in your goals, but you are progressive in your methods, if you're a conservative in your goals, but you're recklessly just, racing towards them, all the chain, we're going to reverse course. All these progressives have been pushing us in the wrong direction. We're going to go back to a better state of affairs. Well, if you do that all at once with no off-ramping and without a gradual return, you risk damaging the society just as much as you probably thought that the progressive goals were going to damage it. And this is I would say it's a difficult truth. I don't know, maybe it isn't. Maybe it's just, to me, it was interesting. I just thought that for a progressive, if you move towards your progressive goals through progressive methods, you are going to destroy society by the time you arrive at those goals, if you ever do, which you might not. Like Popper says, progress is achieved through the formation of institutions and by education of individuals. And it can be lost if institutions have to be maintained, and they are maintained only by individuals who are educated and then committed to maintaining those institutions. And if you put so much change that it shocks the system so much badly that the institutions crumble or are compromised, or that the individuals are no longer getting educated properly, then society will crumble and progress will crumble. So if you're trying to be trying to achieve progressive goals, it is best, I think, to do it through conservative method. On the other hand, if you're a conservative in your goals, it would seem, on this reasoning, to be necessary that you use conservative methodology and resist the temptation to try to, leap backwards or halt everything immediately. Or not even the leaping backwards. Maybe you just want to stop the rapid change. Well, because you're like, this rapid change is destroying things. You might say, yes, you're absolutely right. This rapid change that the progressives have put on us is destroying our society. So therefore, let's stop it immediately. Well, stopping, ironically enough, stopping the rapid change immediately is itself a rapid change that is destructive and shocking. And so, as I said with the freeway off-ramping idea, you have to, if you're in the fast lane on the highway to hell, but let's just say the highway to societal collapse. Yes, let's put it that way. The first thing to do is to get out of the fast lane over into the regular lane. Secondly, is then to get over to the slow lane, and then to get onto the off ramp, and then onto the access road. I've now said 3 different names for those: frontage road, access road, feeder, and there's another one I can't remember. But point being, and then finally onto one of the surface streets where things can be done at a careful and deliberate pace that is not destructive, where there's time to stop before calamitous, accidents happen, where accidents can be avoided because things are going at slower speeds, and if they do happen, they're not as serious. So, yeah, I don't know. That was my thoughts on methodological conservatism and progressivism versus teleological progressivism and conservatism, and that whether you're a teleological progressive or conservative, my point is I think it behooves you to work with a conservative methodology. Yeah. So change, even if it's good and needed, is shocking and needs to be carefully administered. I know there can be people who will say, there might be people who will say, well, if we don't do everything all at once, our opponents will have time to regroup and stop us. That might be true. You might be entirely correct. But then I would suggest that your opponents are basically cornering you into basically encouraging you in a way to destroy the system for them. Because whether it's the destruction that comes about by means of bad goals, or whether it's destruction that comes about by bad and reckless method, the system is destroyed or society is destroyed and people's lives are ruined either way. So, I don't know. And that's on the other hand, if you're so it doesn't matter whether you're a progressive or a conservative in your goals. I think a careful conservative methodology, and there can be slower and, probably a variety in the ways that's approached. I don't know. It seems reasonable. That a sort of a scientific and an intentional, it's not science per se, but kind of analogous to scientific method, if you like. A careful empirical approach is beneficial. We are we're taking chances with, I don't know, yeah, so yeah, that's all I have to say on that. So, if you have any thoughts on that, let me know. I'm not really making an argument for or against conservative or progressive goals here. I'm just saying I think that both conservatives and progressives would behoove themselves to, and would do society a favor if they were careful, or more careful and more deliberate and intentional and scientific with their approach to change than they sometimes are. So, alright, thank you. If you have any thoughts, leave a comment. I appreciate it. So, take care.